when they first got there, the weather was horrendous and they couldn't find it. And that's when they spotted the remainder of the Union Jack just poking out of the snow. It had been completely torn apart by the 130 mile per hour winds. That was the first time Gino thought that Courtauld would be dead. He thought there's no way someone could be alive under there.
In 1930, a 24-year-old explorer named Gino Watkins led a groundbreaking expedition to the east coast of Greenland to map the last unknown coastline of the Arctic and to prove aeroplanes could one day fly across the top of the world. To pull it off, one of his team would have to spend the winter alone on the brutally exposed ice sheet in a canvas tent. What could possibly go wrong? I'm Hugh Taylor, and you're listening to The Art of Adventure, a podcast brought to you by Arthur Beale, outfitters to sailors, adventurers, explorers and vagabonds for over 500 years. Gino Watkins should be a household name. By the age of 25, he had led 3 major expeditions and become one of the most decorated young explorers in the country. But tragically, his story ended too soon. I'm joined today by Nick Watkins, Gino's great-nephew and the filmmaker who has spent the last decade piecing together Gino's story for a new documentary, Bridging the Ice. For Nick, this isn't just history, it's family. And today we're asking, how did Britain's greatest forgotten explorer do so much in so little time? And why has the world let his name slip away? Nick, thank you very much for joining The Art of Adventure. We're delighted to have you here today. And I'm particularly delighted because Gino Watkins is one of my most favourite explorers. And the thing about Gino, as we're going to find out, is actually very few people have ever heard his name or ever even knew he was an explorer. But he is perhaps one of the greatest British explorers, certainly of the last couple of centuries. Perhaps you could tell me about your relationship to him and how you grew up in the sort of the aura of Gino.
Absolutely. So, as you said, Gino is not the most famous. Only in tight Arctic and exploration circles is he as famous as he deserves to be. And that is partly why it was sort of a small-ish deal in my family. So Gino is my father's grandfather's older brother. So he's my great uncle. And there was a painting, which is up in my office, of Gino in Greenland, done by my great-grandfather, Gino's father. And I'd always seen it there and asked about who it was. And my father would just say, oh, your great-uncle was an explorer. But there was never much of a big deal made about it. And then when I got to sort of my mid-teens, I started becoming more interested, started asking more questions. And conveniently at that time, Jeremy Scott, who is my cousin or second cousin, I'm not sure how it works, released a book about Gino. And there had obviously been many, many books written about Gino's life. I think there's now 17 in total or something like that. But because this one was just being released, Dad took me along to the book release because he knew I was interested in it. And from there, I just went headfirst into it and started learning more and more and started reading all the older books.
So one of the defining things about Gino is how much he achieved at such a young age. How on earth did he end up leading expeditions when he was still at university?
Well, so he didn't really know what he wanted to do with his life. The majority of his friends were going off to start careers in business and finance and things, and he did not want to have anything to do with that. That sounded like his worst nightmare. So he went to a meeting while he was still an undergraduate at Cambridge to learn about an expedition going to Greenland. And eventually that expedition fell through, but he was so motivated that he thought, well, I still want to go to Greenland and I'm going to organize my own expedition.
Which for a 20-year-old is just a pretty radical thought in those days.
Yes, he was actually 19 on his first expedition that he organized. It was to Edgware, and he was the youngest person on the expedition that he'd organized. You know, it was him and a group of all older scientists that he'd found for this expedition to Edgware, and they were mapping an areas around one of the rivers there.
And Edgware is one of the islands, isn't it, that make up Svalbard. And this expedition was considered a success.
it was considered a huge success, and it instantly put Gino on the map with the Royal Geographical Society and other institutions who were very interested in seeing what he was going to come up with next. He became quickly the youngest member of the Royal Geographical Society. You weren't actually allowed to be a member at his age, but they had to change the bylaws to have him be a fellow there because they were so impressed by what he'd been doing at a young age.
So he'd done that expedition, but he still had itchy feet. Perhaps you could talk us through how sort of Labrador came to happen and what it is and what they set out to achieve.
So Labrador up towards Newfoundland and the north of Canada is where he went on his next expedition. And that's where he was going with James Scott, who would eventually become his best friend and expedition partner in Greenland. And they were out there, again, mapping a river. And that is where Gino started to, most importantly, learn about speaking to the locals and learning from them. A lot of the thought process in some of the older expeditions were that people would not tend to ask the locals. They sometimes thought that the way the locals were doing things were below them and they didn't need their help. Whereas Gino often knew that the best way to learn about the land was speaking to the locals. And so when he was in Labrador, he had brought a gramophone with him, which he brought everywhere with him. And he started playing the music as loudly as he could. And some of the First Nation would come and start talking to him about what the music was. And then from then he made friends with them and started asking them necessary questions about the land, which he hadn't already learned from people.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Out of all the explorers sort of we've covered in this podcast, all the ones who've led expeditions tend to have come from a service, a sort of military or naval background. And as a result, there is a degree of hierarchy within those expeditions. And as you say, a degree of, I suppose you call it arrogance in terms of not searching out what the locals think. And Gino was, as you say, very different in that mindset.
Exactly, yes. I mean, he did not come from a service background. He had applied to join the military when he was younger and got rejected, which was very sad for his father, who was a colonel in the Coldstream Guards. But it would have been a strange choice because he hated authority and it would never have worked, him being in the military. He didn't like that formality. He didn't like that hierarchy. He liked everyone to communicate together, talk through their ideas. And as he said, he wanted everyone to be a leader if they had to be.
Okay, so they came back from Labrador, and what had they achieved in Labrador?
So they were mapping the Hamilton River, which was an unexplored area up there. So again, just taking drawings, taking photographs, surveying. That's where Gino really learned most of those skills. Even though he wouldn't do much of that in his future life, he did learn to do those there. And that's where he was doing a lot of canoeing, which would significantly go towards his kayaking expertise in Greenland. So canoeing was their main mode of transport around the Hamilton River in Newfoundland. So he learned quickly that it's a great method of transport.
Excellent. So already at the age of 21, 22, 2 successful expeditions under his belt. What was next?
So it was actually on that expedition that he was talking to James Scott in their tent, and they were trying to work out how they would organize the next expedition, because they knew they wanted to do another one, but there was not one planned and they didn't have any money raised for the next one. There was no idea. And that's when Gino had actually, while looking at the map, had come up with the idea that you could fly to North America using stepping stones across the Northern Hemisphere. So he was telling Jim Scott that if you landed in Iceland, then Greenland, then Labrador, then down to New York, that all of the stops are short enough for planes of that era, for the range of their engines, as long as you could have fuel depots in those places. So that was his plan. And that's what he planned to research when he got back to England and talked to the RGS about.
And the British Arctic Air Route Expedition, as it was called, was at the time a sort of very famous and high-profile expedition.
It was, yes. It was a very big deal. I mean, transatlantic flight was on everyone's minds. Planes were starting to be seen as a way of long-distance travel, even though they were considered dangerous. They were quite high-risk planes at the time. They didn't have good range. They would get very cold. They would make a lot of noise. They couldn't travel very far. There weren't many safety features. So it was considered a dangerous activity. But for people who did want to travel, this was the main way that they were going to be able to travel transatlantically. And Gino knew that. And that's why he spoke to the RGS in terms of scientific purposes. But then he also spoke to companies like Pan Am, who would obviously be interested in the upcoming commercial airline industry, who would help fund his expeditions.
So the key objective was obviously to check out that the weather above, particularly Greenland, was appropriate for airplanes to fly over.
Exactly. So the main objectives, firstly, if they're approaching it from the east, they needed to confirm the height of those coastal mountains on the east. The eastern coast was almost entirely unmapped. So it was very important that they learn the height of those mountains to see if planes of the day could even go over those mountains to be able to fly over Greenland. And then the next part was to test flying conditions over the ice sheet, the main central part of Greenland. The ice sheet takes up about 80% of Greenland. And they needed to make sure that the planes could fly over it in terms of wind speed and things like that, because there was almost nothing known about the ice sheet.
So they were going to establish a weather center, in effect, right in the middle of the ice sheet.
Exactly, yeah. So Gino sort of looked at the map and worked out exactly where the center of the ice sheet would be in terms of where planes would be flying across it. And that's where he planned to put the weather station. And they would have 2 people manning it every few months throughout an entire year to test wind speed, temperature, and things like that. And that had never been done. Nobody had ever been on the ice sheet in winter.
So, I mean, this is actually quite a big expedition, presumably quite a lot of funds to be raised.
Yes, it was. It was the equivalent of many millions of pounds today. And this was tough for Gino to organize. So there was 2 planes they needed. They had to have a backup. And then they were hiring the Quest, which was Shackleton's old ship.
The ship that Shackleton had the heart attack and died on, wasn't it?
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
So those were the 2 biggest expenses. And then there was the crew. They had all the crew from the Navy to actually man the ship. But then the majority of the people actually on the expedition were either other undergraduates from Cambridge or people that Gino or Scott had met on other expeditions. But they were all very young. And almost all of them weren't being paid for it.
I mean, it was unheard of at this time to have such a young expedition undertaking what was quite a major task. It was incredible that someone like him could galvanize not only, his colleagues and friends, but the RGS, I think the Admiralty were involved, obviously Pan Am. Yeah, it was a phenomenal achievement in its own right just to get the expedition together.
Absolutely. And especially considering he was age 24. This is just absolutely crazy. And the average age of the expedition was 25. So, I mean, they were all quite young and he was younger than the average. So it was an unbelievable feat.
So tell us what happened on this expedition.
So they started off from England. They sailed up the Thames and then headed up towards the Faroe Islands, where they picked up some whale meat for the dogs and the sled dogs. They had always planned to use sled dogs. This was always the best way to get around Greenland in the winter. Again, something Gino had researched from reading and learning about the Inuit. James Scott was the only person who really knew anything about sled dogs. So Gino had sent him to the Faroe Islands to pick up the dogs. And this was the first hurdle of the expedition because these were not like the dogs Gino was used to in England. They were very wild and untamed and caused instant havoc on the ship where they were running loose. When they got to Greenland, they stopped in Massalik, the first major town, the only major town on the east coast, where they had their first encounter with the Inuit. They spent some time with them there and started to talk to them. Again, Gino exhibiting that would be his first port of call for learning about the land. Started talking to them about the best place for them to set up their base. He was listing the different requirements they had. They needed easy access for the ice sheet, go and set up the weather station. They needed a good landing strip, and then they needed reasonable protection from the winds, which they knew were going to be bad. They didn't know quite how bad they were going to be, so they needed a decent amount of protection there. So the Inuit had recommended a small inlet about 30 miles west of Massalik. which is where they headed to and started to set up their base camp.
So then, having set up the base camp, what did they do next?
The first thing Gino did was go up in the plane. He was very interested in just getting a lay of the land and sort of becoming familiar with the area. He first went down to another village to start talking to some of the Inuit about the area and about moving on to the ice sheet, which was their main first objective. And unfortunately, they had told him that they never go onto the ice sheet. There's no hunting there. There's nothing that supports life on the ice sheet. And they also believed it was, they had, it's a shamanistic religion that the Inuits had at the time. And so they believed that there were evil spirits and ghosts and demons and things in the wind on the ice sheet. So this was a bit of a concern to Gino, but he didn't tell the rest of the team. And then he started sailing up the eastern coast to start mapping those mountains, while he sent another team to go and start establishing the weather station onto the ice sheet.
I think those who were trying to establish the weather centre on the ice sheet were coming across horrendous weather, weren't they?
Not at first. It was still the beginning of summer. So on that first expedition, they actually had quite good weather, but they had discovered that where they had chosen for their base camp was not necessarily ideal. There was a very, very steep, solid ice bank right above their base camp. It was a really steep access onto the first part of the ice sheet, and it was about 30 degrees and solid ice. And obviously, they didn't have the sort of crampons and ice axes we have today. So this was a huge hurdle each time they wanted to get up and down onto the ice sheet, because the dogs can't grip on ice that steep. So they had to winch up all the dogs and sleds by hand, including, hundreds of pounds worth of equipment. I think 400 pounds on average they would have on each sled worth of equipment. And they had to winch this up, Bugbear Bank, as they referred to it, each time. And it caused enormous delays.
And did they manage to establish all the sort of the depots on the way to this, where they were going to have the weather station?
So they had one major depot, a big flag depot, just north of the Bugbear Bank, where they set up food and supplies. But then from then on, there was nothing. They just set up flags every half mile all the way to where they would establish the weather station, to the location that Gino had picked out for the weather station.
Right.
So there was no supplies. Once they got past Big Flag Depot, there was nothing. The Greenland ice sheet, nothing grows, nothing's there. So everything beyond that point, they would have to have with them.
And it was about 130 miles, wasn't it, from the depot to the weather station?
Yes.
And the idea was there would be two people who stayed in the weather station all year round.
Exactly, yes. So they would go in 2-man shifts, and because it would be a lot of work digging out the station each time a storm came in, and there were a lot of instruments to read up there. They wanted 2 people on support there throughout the year.
Right. So everything was set up. Everything sounds perfect.
Everything's going well so far. They had the first shift go quite well, and then on the second shift is where they started to encounter wind and trouble on the ice sheet, and discover quite how long it could drastically change. The journey in perfect weather could take 10 days, and then some of the journeys ended up taking 6 weeks. So they learned quite quickly that this was going to be a problem, and relieving that first team, they were already late to pick them up, and that first team were very pleased to see them. Apparently, they said sleeping in the tents was like living through a constant artillery bombardment, just because of the speed of the wind hitting the tents and the noises that it was making. So it was a rough place to be sleeping.
So the first relief, although they were delayed, went according to plan.
It did. They were slightly late, but it did go according to plan. And Bingham and Riley were the second team that were left there.
And then when it came for them to be relieved?
So this is where we sort of divert subjects a bit, I think, because while that second team is going, this is when Gino is continuing up the East Coast, which is a fairly significant part of the expedition. This is where he's going on multiple flights. He's testing the heights of the mountains and looking for, at the time, an area that he would eventually hoped to build an airport. While Gino was taking all the survey flights, that's when he saw in the distance what looked like a mountain range. But there was no mountain ranges on the map that far in, and there was nothing anywhere near that height. And so they took the Moth a little further inland to start looking towards them, and they realized that these mountains were going much higher than the Moth was going to be able to go. And the Moth had a, I think, ceiling of 14,000 feet at the time, but these mountains were larger than that, Gino believed. And it was confirmed later that these were completely unknown mountains. No one had ever seen them before. And they were the highest mountains in the Arctic that Gino had discovered.
Yeah, and quite an important discovery based on what the objective of the expedition was.
Absolutely, because they would have to avoid those specific mountains on the route to Greenland across the ice sheet because planes couldn't go over them at the time.
Where does the story take us now?
So Gino wanted to go even further up that east coast, but it was starting to get late in autumns, and the ice was starting to seal around the boat. And the problem is in that situation is, if the ice traps you, then they have to spend the winter there. They have to wait for the full freeze. They have to live off the land there and then wait for it to thaw and then move down in spring. And considering those winter weather station objectives were the next most important part, Gino knew he needed to get down south to the base and help with that. So they turned around and went back. And this is when that third man trip to the weather station started to become troublesome. So Gino got down to the base and joined Courtauld and Spencer Chapman on a trip up to Big Flag Depot, which is where they split off. So Scott and Gino were going to do a trip across the ice sheet to see if there were any mountains that hadn't been spotted before that might get in the way of flights. And at that time, they were telling Courtauld to head up to the weather station. And they knew the weather was going to be bad in autumn, but they had no idea quite how bad it was going to be. They were encountering 130 mile per hour winds. It was minus 40 degrees centigrade at times, and they made almost no progress. And Gino on his own expedition across the ice sheet, him and Scott were getting in a lot of trouble, and they were running out of food, and the dogs, because of the temperature and the conditions, were needing more food, so they were giving them food from their own rations. So Gino and Scott were running out of supplies quite quickly, and they'd only made about a third of the journey across the ice sheet when they realized they had to turn around and make it back, otherwise they were going to die. But then the weather was equally horrendous on their way home, and they made very, very slow progress to the point where they had discussed using morphia tablets, which they all traveled with them to save themselves from a painful death. If they were trapped in a situation without food and couldn't travel, they would just take these morphine tablets and die peacefully in their tent. And Gino told Scott, if anything happens to me, please look after Pam, who was his younger sister. And this was because Gino's family were not in the best shape at the time. Colonel Watkins, Gino, Pam, and my grandfather Tony's father had moved to Switzerland and started a new life with a new woman, and left my great grandmother with the three children with very little money. And she found that hard to cope with and unfortunately committed suicide. So the three children were left with almost no money and no one to look after them. So Gino had become the de facto head of the Watkins household in his early 20s. So he was looking after his brother and sister financially.
And he almost didn't go on the expedition, didn't he? And I think his father persuaded him he was so upset by his mother's death, and his father persuaded him to still go.
Absolutely. He was very concerned about his brother and sister. He had a big sense of devotion to them and thought that he should be looking after them. But it was also Pam, as well as his father, who said, no, you have to go.
Excellent. So they are struggling to get back.
They're stuck on the ice sheet heading back towards Big Flag Depot. And, even though they are in such a serious situation, Gino always apparently tried to make light of every situation. And he started talking about how if Scott was going to die, Gino would be eating him first because Scott was the fat one and he'd be much more appetizing to eat than Gino would be. But cannibalism, as you've discovered on one of your last podcasts, was a big deal in Arctic adventure.
Yes, exactly. It was never far from happening in many instances, actually.
But they were on the verge of taking those morphia tablets, and because they had no idea if they were going to be able to get back, they didn't think they were going to be, and they basically had no food now, and the dogs weren't eating, so the dogs were barely moving. And right to that time, they had one good day of weather, and they made reasonable progress, and they saw a party in the distance. This was actually Courtauld and Chapman, who were supposedly coming back from the weather station, having left Courtauld there, but they were moving in the wrong direction. So they were supposed to be coming back from the weather station, but they were still on their way towards the weather station, which didn't make sense to Gino. So he caught up with them and found out what had been happening. And obviously they had encountered the same weather that Gino and Scott were in. So they had not made it to the weather station as planned. They got to the first Big Flag depot and their tents had been blown away on one of the first attempts. Their sleds broke and they had to go back. And at the time, they were eating all the food that was supposed to be left for the weather station. So as they were struggling to get there, they were eating more and more food that was supposed to be left for the two people over that crucial winter period. And it was Courtauld's idea that there was no way that two people could be left with the amount of food that was left. And so a few days before they got to the weather station, Courtauld told Chapman, "I need to stay here alone, otherwise this isn't going to work." And Chapman saw his point, but said, we'll talk about it later. And so eventually they did get to the weather station considerably later than they had planned, and relieved Bingham and Riley, who were very, very pleased to see them, obviously. They were several weeks late for them. And they all had a meeting together, and Courtauld explained that he liked being on his own. He had brought a bunch of books with him. He knew how to do all the instruments. He would be fine on his own. And Chapman, who was the first in command in terms of that group, realized it was either let Courtauld stay on his own or they would have to abandon the weather station, which would mean the failure of the British Arctic Air Route expedition, because if they didn't have knowledge of the ice sheet through the winter, then they would never know if planes would be able to make it across okay.
And it was actually incredibly brave of Courtauld, because obviously no one had done that before on the ice sheet. The chances of being snowed in were very high. And how long was he meant to be there on his own?
He was meant to be there for 2 months, 2.5 months. He'd worked out the supplies and he could have most of a day's rations for that time, but he figured if he could stretch it out to half rations, he could last twice that. Although he would quickly realize that with the amount of work that he was doing in the cold out there, that he would need to eat considerably more than he thought, because the instruments had to be read every 3 hours. And this involved digging yourself out because the snow was blowing, covering up the entrance to the weather station. So you'd have to dig it out and then climb through the deep snow, go through the wind, read all the instruments, which involved taking off your gloves and things. They were sensitive little instruments, and taking all these notes and then going back inside. So it was a huge amount of work up there, and that was through the night he was doing those. So he realized he had to be eating the rations, and his attitude was he'll just eat what he wants to and then deal with it at the end, which probably wasn't going to end up being the best idea.
So he's left on his own. Meanwhile, the others go back to the depot.
The others go back to the main base. They start heading back. They left Courtauld with almost all of the supplies they had with them. They actually almost died on their way back. And the way back's supposed to be the easy part. It's downhill and should have been fine, but they had so little food with them that they got trapped and were just eating plain margarine by the end to survive to get home. But they left him just before Christmas, and they came back, and now all of the party were together for the first time since arrival, except for Courtauld, who's obviously alone at the weather station. So this was when Courtauld became the sort of like main part of the expedition, because during winter, there's not actually that much they can do from the base camp. It's dark, almost 24 hours a day, that high. So really, the main job they had was fishing and gathering food for the people at the base camp. Gino's idea was to live off the land as much as possible. And so this is when he went back to the nearest Inuit settlement and he started learning about their hunting practices. And in the winter at the time, one of their main way of seal hunting was to find breathing holes that seals keep open. When you find one of these holes, you just sit by it and wait, and with a spear in your hand, and you hope that a seal is still using this hole and it pops up. You catch it with the harpoon, and then that's their meal. So that's what Gino and the team were trying to do. And then he learned from them that this was not their preferred method. The main way that they liked to hunt was from kayak. That was their main tool for the Inuit, the kayak. Almost all of their food came from the water, and seal was used for everything for them.
So, and Gino had obviously sort of learnt to kayak, hadn't he, in Canada?
Well, it was canoeing that he'd been doing in Labrador. In Greenland was his first time using a kayak. So the canoes that he was using in Labrador were open and they were much, much longer. And you sit on top of them. And the kayak was much more hazardous, obviously, because you're sealed into the kayak. They're much more narrow, so they can tip very easily. And when they do tip, because you're sealed into it, if you can't right yourself, you drown. And about a third of Inuit deaths at the time happened from drowning at sea. But he wasn't actually able to start learning to kayak until later in the year when the water started to freeze.
Right. And meanwhile, Courtauld is at the weather station on his own over Christmas in pretty horrific weather. What's going on with him?
I mean, at first, he actually was quite enjoying the time on his own, but it did become extremely cold very quickly. And he'd realized that one of his paraffin had leaked, and that had used up an enormous amount of his reserves. So he could no longer use a lamp to heat the tent. So he had to keep all of that paraffin that he had left for melting ice for drinking water. And the tent, although they had taken some work to insulate it, it was negative in there. It was essentially like being outside. It was a canvas tent, and then they had built snow blocks on top of it. Again, learning from Inuit practices, they had turned this canvas tent into an igloo, essentially. And by now, it was about a third under the snow, which helps with insulation. But still, it was freezing in there, and there were icicles inside the tent that were dripping on Courtauld, and his sleeping bag would stay wet from condensation. And so it was starting to become fairly miserable, especially considering he was realizing that his food was going to be running a bit low.
And every time he wanted to take some weather readings, he had to sort of dig himself out, didn't he?
Yes, exactly. So there was an entrance after an underground tunnel from the tent. So there was a sort of U-bend that would keep heat from leaving the tent. On one of the occasions in the middle of winter, he had cleared that hole and was taking his instruments. And then he realized that he'd left the spade on the outside of the tent. So he'd crawled back inside, and then the tunnel had been sealed by a heavy, heavy blizzard. And there was no way of digging it out by hand, which was a very big problem. So he had to go into, there was the main tent that he was living in, and then there were two smaller tents either side. One was his toilet, and the other one was his storage area. And so he went into the storage supply area, and he cut a hole in the roof of that tent, and then dug up through a few feet of snow. Because that was, the storage tent was a lot smaller, he had to dig through 4 feet of snow to get to the surface from that tent. But at least he had a way out for now. And he'd been using that for a few weeks. And then one of the storms was so bad then that it filled in the entire storage tent, and there was no way of getting out.
He's trapped inside, in effect.
He is fully trapped. Luckily, it's now getting to late February, where the worst of winter is behind him. So he's taken meteorological readings throughout that winter and seen the worst of winter. So when he is trapped in there, it's not a disaster for the readings, which he was nervous about.
But potentially a disaster for him.
Potentially a disaster for him. Because at that point, when he was trapped inside, the snow is now 2/3 of the way up the outside of the weather station. So they had what they thought was a very viewable weather station from a distance. It was about 9 feet high, the main tent, and then there was a Union Jack on a long pole next to the weather station. And they thought that this would be easy to find and more than enough. But by this time, the snow was almost to the top of the tent. And so Courtauld was very nervous at this point, because now that he couldn't go out there and clear snow from around the tent, eventually that snow would continue. And that would eventually block the pipe that is his only way of breathing. And without air, he would suffocate. But even if without worrying about suffocation, if it covered the tent, when the relief party did manage to get there, they would have no way of finding him if he was just buried under a flat snowscape.
So meanwhile, he was expecting a relief party in February, I think, was it? Is that towards the end of February?
Yes, towards the end of February. And it was getting to March, and he was very seriously running out of food. He had run out of tobacco. He was smoking tea leaves, which he said was one of his biggest problems. He was a smoker, and he said there's now very little to live for when the tobacco ran out.
And where was the relief party then?
Their sleds broke on the first attempt. And then on the second attempt, they had gotten a few miles inwards, and they got trapped by a storm for like 2 weeks and used up almost all the supplies that they had planned to get to the station. So they decided to turn around, and they went on a third attempt to get there. And Scott was not the best at navigating. He had the most experiences with traveling with sled dogs, which is why Gino sent him as the leader of this most important rescue expedition. But Scott wasn't the best navigator, so he was going to have to use an old-fashioned method. He could establish the latitude of the ice cap station to the east and then move along that line to find the weather station. But this was obviously more time-consuming than going straight to it, because they had to travel extra distance. And they got into the area. They were within a mile of the base camp they had established from taking readings, but because the visibility was within a few yards, they couldn't find him. They spent 3 weeks quartering the area looking for him, and they saw no evidence of the base camp or Courtauld whatsoever. This was becoming a real big problem because they were running out of food. They had not intended to be there for 3 weeks. And Scott had to decide whether they stay there and keep looking and start eating the dogs and feeding the dogs to the other dogs. And then if they did find the base camp station, they'd have to walk back with Courtauld on foot, or turn around and go tell a new party to come up and look for him. And that is what Scott ultimately did. But Scott would consider this the most damaging decision that he'd made in his life. He saw himself as a failure from this decision, and it would be the last expedition that he went on because of this. It haunted him for the whole journey back to the base camp. He thought he should stay there and, if necessary, sacrifice his own life to look for Courtauld. But that's not what he did. And he came back and told Gino what had happened. And so Gino decided he would go himself.
And when was this?
This was in April by now.
So we're 2 months after Courtauld should have been relieved. So the chances of him being alive were relatively slim, actually.
Very slim, yes, because even with the amount of supplies they thought he had, they still thought he was going to be on the verge of survival. He was weeks away from running out of paraffin to heat water to drink when Gino left on the final rescue mission. So he thought he was 2 weeks away from having to turn around and walk on his own back to base camp. And at that time, he was eating almost no food, and he had bad frostbite in all of his toes.
But also he was trapped. He couldn't really get out, could he?
Well, he could. His only way out now was to go through the main tent. Right. Because there was still enough surface. Because the brass breathing pipe was only a few inches above the surface of the tent, he knew if he could still breathe, then there was still air there. So he could, if he wanted to, cut around the pipe. But if he made that decision to cut himself out of there, then that would fill in his only way of survival. So He could get out if he was going to commit to walking home, but then he would be dead if he tried to stay there.
Right. And who does Gino set out with?
He sets out with Chapman. They experienced much better weather than Scott had been experiencing the previous attempts. Although they did get trapped a few times, they did reach the weather station area in the middle of April. And when they first got there, the weather was horrendous and they couldn't find it. But then they did wake up in the morning and the weather was clear. They all took a dog by hand to hope that the dogs would sniff out Courtauld, and they went out in a fan searching the area that they thought it would be. And that's when they spotted the remainder of the Union Jack just poking out of the snow. It had been completely torn apart by the 130 mile per hour winds. And that was the first time Gino thought that Courtauld would be dead. When he saw the state of the weather station, he thought there's no way someone could be alive under there. So he walked over nervously and called down the pipe, "Are you all right?" And he heard a voice. Courtauld said, "Yes, I'm perfectly fit," was his first line, which is probably a bit of an exaggeration.
So they dug him out.
They dug him out. He was 2 days away from running out of water. So Courtauld had decided 2 days later he was going to cut himself out of the main tent, which would then collapse in, and he would walk home on his own.
And the chances of him walking 130 miles.
I mean, even at his best, the chances are almost non-existent. His muscles were atrophied. He was extremely weak from no food. He had frostbite in all his toes. There was absolutely no chance he would be able to make it back on his own. So he was extremely relieved to see the party. And he looked very different from when they had left him. He had a very long beard and long hair. His face was black from the soot of the paraffin lamp that had been heating his water. But he was alive and sane, which is what they were most concerned about, because Bingham, the doctor, was convinced that he would lose his mind and they would get there and that he would be a completely different person. But he wasn't. He had his books. He said he found ways to entertain himself. He was a big fan of maths, and he would just do arithmetic that he had no use for. He designed himself a boat that he would later in life build, and then he brought several books with him, which he read and reread and reread.
And he obviously had preserved all the weather reports and the weather recordings, which are critical to the success of the expedition.
Exactly. The success of the expedition had come down solely to him, thanks to him maintaining those records over the winter. They knew the top wind speed over the ice sheet in the middle of winter. They knew the lowest temperatures, all because of him maintaining those. And that, as well as the mountain readings, the mountain heights that Gino had established on the journey up the East Coast, collectively meant the expedition was a success. They had completed all their main objectives after rescuing Courtauld.
So they got Courtauld back to the depot. Did they head straight back to Britain to claim their great success?
Not quite yet. They had a few more months left of the expedition. One of the things they wanted to do was still do that traverse across the middle of the ice sheet to find out if any of those mountains existed that would impede flights. But while they were waiting to do that, Gino had, as I said, spent time with the Inuit learning to hunt seal through the breathing holes. But now that the ice had melted and the sea was open water again, he wanted to learn to hunt from the kayak, because Gino was planning to come back and he realized that this was the best way to hunt seal. So Gino moved to the local Inuit settlement and he started practicing with the Inuit. They made him a kayak specifically designed for him. It was famously a white kayak. It stood out among all the others. They were, seals are typically gray and black and things, and they had given him a special pure white one. And him and the majority of the expedition all had kayaks made for them, and they all started to practice. And a lot of them were fairly hopeless at it, but Gino was so dedicated that he would practice all day, and he became quickly incredible at it. And no non-Greenlander had ever been able to do the types of things he was able to do on a kayak. He learned to set it upright if he overturned, which, as I said, was a very crucial step, because if you get overturned, either struggling with a seal or hit by a wave, you'll drown if you can't upright yourself. He became famous among the Greenlanders as being the only non-local who could master the kayak. He started to supply the team for these final elements of the trip with his seal hunting. And this is how he realized he could do more expeditions like this, living off the land, because it became such an effective way. He was so excited about this. When he returned to England, he brought all the kayaks back with him and he wanted to introduce the sport to the UK. And he's now considered among kayak historians as the godfather of British kayaking.
And they did, once they'd done the traverse, they were back in the UK to great acclaim.
Exactly, yes. So they arrived back. God Save the Queen was being played by a brass band. It was a huge deal. The Times and lots of other papers had been keeping all of England up to date on the expedition. They were famous at that point. Gino received the Polar Award from the King, and Gino wanted to capitalize on this fame. He wanted to do a next, even bigger and better expedition. His first idea at the time was to be the first to cross Antarctica. The big mystery that still remained in polar exploration was whether Antarctica was 1 or 2 pieces of ice. Gino wanted to be the first one to cross it, to find that out. Unfortunately, when they arrived back in England in 1931, it was the worst time to be raising funds for an expedition. It was the height of the Great Depression. So he did spend months and months trying to raise funds for this Antarctic expedition, but it was just proving to be hopeless. So he reverted to an offer that he had had from Pan Am to go back to Greenland. He didn't necessarily want to go back to Greenland. He thought he'd sort of done Greenland, but Pan Am wanted him to go back to an area that he'd spotted, that he'd told Pan Am would be a good place to set up an airport. So when all of the rest of his funding fell through, he realized this would be his only hope if he did want to go on any sort of expedition. It was either that or nothing. But even that, it was going to cost him some of his own money. Pan Am were struggling as well, and they only had £500 to give him. Gino didn't think it would cover the trip, but he was so desperate to do something. He found England depressing and didn't want to be there. So he took up the offer and went on that trip to Greenland. And the first person he asked was his best friend, Scott, his second in command. And Scott had told him that he found a job, so couldn't go. But this was a lie. Scott was so disappointed by what had happened on the ice sheet. He never went on another expedition again and considered himself a failure, unfortunately. It's very sad. I think Gino would have loved to have had him there. But he went with Spencer Chapman and Riley. So there were only 3 of them. So they went from 30 to 3 people on the second expedition because they had so little money. So they sailed out as a team of 3. This time they went back to Amasilik, but instead of going west to the same Inuit, they went straight up the eastern coast to this area that Gino called Lake Fjord, which was the area that he thought would be the best place to set up an airport. So they built their base camp there. They started taking readings and going about their work. Gino had established Riley and Scott to be the ones taking the meteorological readings and going and surveying the land around the airport. And Gino had called himself the hunter. He would be the one who would supply the team with food because, again, they had to hunt to be able to survive. And Gino had become expert at this on the last trip. But he was going out alone now because when he was hunting in nearer Amasilik, he would sometimes go out with the Inuit there, and he had many friends down there that he would go out with. But he actually learned that if you go on your own, you have more likelihood of catching a seal because you're more quiet. Although the Inuit told him that this was an extremely dangerous way to do it because if something went wrong, you're in a lot of trouble. But this is what Gino wanted to do, and he liked being on his own. He liked being that primal hunter out on his own, supplying for his team. And so there was this large glacier where the seals would hang out. So that's where he'd been on the first few days of the expedition hunting, and he had successfully caught a seal there. A few days later, a piece of ice carved off the glacier above him. And when this hits the water, it creates a tsunami, essentially. He had been smashed up against the rocks. He damaged his kayak and damaged his wrist. And so he was aware that this was a dangerous activity to be doing. And he told Chapman and Riley about this, and they again said, you shouldn't be doing this on your own. But he did. And he went out again a few days later. And while he was out, the other team heard that large crack, heard the sound of ice carving off the glacier again. And they didn't pay much attention to it. But then they were at the base waiting, and Gino didn't come home. So they went out looking for him, and they found his kayak and they found his trousers, but they did not find Gino. So they weren't exactly sure of what had happened to him. They assumed because his trousers were there that he had fallen into the water from the ice carving, and he had taken off his trousers to swim better, and then probably drowned because the water temperature is unsurvivable. So that's what they assumed, but they could never find his body. So they really have no idea. You know, they kept looking, and because they thought he was so adept with his kayak, there was no chance that something like this could have happened. But he was dead.
It's incredible. I mean, he was 25 years old, and he had achieved so much. And, you know, as many people say, he is Britain's greatest explorer, which he did all within 5 years. And obviously, because he died so young, and also I think because he was successful in everything he did, and all the other famous explorers like Scott or like Shackleton all encountered a lot of failure along the way. But with Gino dying young and being successful, he's not remembered for some reason.
Yes, I think unfortunately because of his young death is the main reason he's not remembered. And like you said, he was in some ways more successful than these people. Scott and Shackleton both had people die on their expeditions. Gino never lost a man. He would have been, I think, up with those names had he lived longer.
It's a fascinating story, and a great privilege to have you as a relative of Gino here telling us the story. And of course, we're going to be able to find out even more about the story because you've got a documentary coming out.
Yes, exactly. So I've been working on this documentary for a very long time, almost a decade now. And I finally managed to go to Greenland myself 2 summers ago to film the final parts of the documentary. And it's just been an incredible process. I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds of photos and hours of film that has never been used for anything at all. The team did make a short silent movie where they used some of the footage, but then that was essentially never seen again. And I've used the vast majority of everything else that was filmed, and it's spectacular seeing all of them come to life in all of this amazing film footage.
You mentioned at the beginning that you know, Gino was not particularly well publicized or well known within your family, or certainly what he'd accomplished. But actually, during the course of the documentary, you found out a lot more about him. Did you suddenly feel more of an affinity with him?
Absolutely. I mean, as I said, my father, he didn't talk that much about Gino. And when I started to speak to the rest of my family members, my aunt and the Scott family, it just became so much more personal because I was learning more about Gino's life, because obviously I had the film and photos of the expedition and his work, but it was only when I started talking to my aunts and uncles and cousins and that I started getting all the photo albums of Gino and my grandfather as a kid, what his life was like, that it became very family orientated. You know, at first it was just this 25-year-old who was doing scientific work, and I was just looking into that. But then, you know, I'm now looking at baby photos of Gino and my grandfather playing together as children. So it became hard to detach from the personal side of it. And there was a lot of tragedy on that side of the family. Gino's younger brother, my grandfather, had killed himself not long after Gino's death. And my father had recently passed away in the middle of me making this film. So I ended up spending a lot of time with my family talking about these things. And it became a really personal experience making this film, and bookending that with being able to go to Greenland and experiencing the same places that Gino went really finished that off for me. Everything I had seen was in black and white, and finally I was stood in the base camp where Gino had been sleeping for that 2 years, that major expedition, and seeing how stunning this land was and what made him fall in love with it. And I knew we had shared some interest like climbing and skiing, but seeing this land and seeing how incredible it was and wanting to spend more and more time there myself just really made me understand him more as a person.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you for sharing the story with us. We will look out for that documentary and look forward to seeing it. And as I mentioned earlier, obviously Gino was a customer of Arthur Bill, and on our website you can see a telegram he sent to us from Greenland asking for an urgent restock of rope. So it's a story very close to our hearts, and thank you very much for sharing it with us today.
No problem, and I look forward to everyone seeing it. It's currently out with the distributor Chip Taylor Communications, who's shopping it around to all of the main platforms, and it should be on the air for people to see in the next few months. But until then, I'm making updates on the website, bridgingtheicedoc.com. So if anyone's interested, they can follow along there, watch teasers, see photos from the film, and they'll learn about when the film is first available to see.
Thank you for listening to The Art of Adventure. And a huge thank you to Nick Watkins for sharing Gino's story with us. The links to find out more about his upcoming film are in our show notes. This series is brought to you by Arthur Bill. We've been proudly outfitting sailors, adventurers and explorers like Gino Watkins himself for over 500 years. What adventures would you like to hear us cover in upcoming episodes? We'd love to hear your ideas. Please leave your suggestions in a review or comment. Next week, we'll be diving into the thrilling story of the Golden Globe race, a non-stop solo circumnavigation of the world. Look forward to seeing you then. This show was hosted by me, Hugh Taylor, and produced by M. Wally. Theme music is by Nassan Da Silva.